Patrick Henry College has established an exceptional reputation as a college that nurtures high-caliber talent through a rigorous classical Christian education. It is a place where young leaders come who want more than the status quo, who want to dig deeper, aim higher, and dare greater. PHC teaches students more than just facts. They learn to think clearly, speak articulately, and write persuasively. The classical approach, combined with distinctive apprenticeships and a biblical worldview, enables our students to serve and lead at the highest levels. Our goal is not to simply produce students who have acquired knowledge during their 4 years here, but students who have also learned to pursue godly wisdom both in their private and public lives. My name is Jack Hay, and I serve as president of Patrick Henry College. It's my privilege to welcome you today to this Newsmaker interview with Dr. Marvin Olasky. Dr. Olasky's work as a journalist, editor, author, and critical thinker makes him the ideal host to tackle the complex issues of our time. His insightful questions and commentary help his readers have a deeper understanding of these important topics, allowing us all to be better equipped to participate in the cultural conversation. So please join me in welcoming your host, Dr. Marvin Olasky.
Well, I appreciate President Hay's kind words, but we have an unusual setup this evening because, well, Richard Weaver, 70 years ago, published a wonderful and important book called Ideas Have Consequences. In the past several weeks, I've been able to produce an article that could be called Typos Have Consequences. When I invited Nancy here in an email, I explained the pleasure of being able to speak to Patrick Henry students, but I gave her the wrong date, thus the typo, and thus I appreciate Nancy's graciousness in appearing before us electronically from Houston Baptist University, where she is scholar in residence. She has a master's in biblical studies from Covenant Theological Seminary, and most people who have masters never really show their mastery of the subject matter. Nancy actually has shown mastery with many books, including Total Truth, Finding Truth, and the latest, Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. So please join me in thanking Nancy for appearing electronically and giving us such a provocative title to discuss tonight. Now, a bit of Nancy's background, I think, is important here because she was one of the young people who stumbled across Francis Schaeffer's ministry, L'Abri, in Switzerland in the early 1970s. And she was an agnostic at that time, and she discovered that there are good reasons, good arguments supporting Christianity. And through a process of a couple of years, she gave up her agnosticism, and ever since she's been writing about Christianity as a worldview applied to every area of life. She was a very valuable assistant to Chuck Colson for many years, and now she's written these books. And the background is important because in discussing a couple of the topics that she deals with in her book, such as homosexuality and transsexuality, there's sometimes among evangelicals the sense that these things just came out of nowhere. Whoa, where did that come from? Such a surprise. And there's sometimes a sense, well, this is a conspiracy brought to us by the Supreme Court. So it's just 9 people in black robes who brought us the current situation. And I think Nancy, with her L'Abri Francis Schaeffer training, is able to point out that this did not come out of nowhere, and it did not come just because of the thinking of a few people in black robes, but it's a logical extension of developments for many years. And Nancy, if you're willing, I'd like to have you run through the step-by-step process that you talk about in Love Thy Body as to how these new things have come about. You up for that?
Yes, definitely. I'm up for it. I'm glad you started with L'Abri because it was Francis Schaeffer who first introduced Christians to the notion that the very concept of truth had been divided. He used the metaphor of 2 stories in a building. And so essentially, after the rise of modern science, many people concluded that the only valid form of knowledge is empirical knowledge, what we can know by science. And what does that mean then for morality and theology? What it means is, well, it can't be studied under a test. It can't be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. And so many people concluded that when you're talking about morality or theology, those are not really truths after all, that in fact, they're just a matter of personal, private, subjective opinion. That's your personal feelings. We hear people say that can be true for you, but not true for me. Or we hear people say, don't impose your values on me. But we never hear people say, don't impose your facts on me, because it's assumed that scientific facts are reliable. For a long time, nobody really quite knew what to do with that divided concept of truth from Schaeffer. He used the metaphor of two stories in a building. So people said, well, maybe it's just kind of an interesting metaphor for relativism. And it was many years later when I was studying something that in secular academia, it's called the fact-value split. And I thought, wait a minute, this is what Schaeffer was talking about. This is how secular people talk about that divided concept of truth. They say, on the one hand, in the lower story, we have facts, what is scientifically knowable, what is objective, what is testable. And then values are just whatever you value. In other words, it comes from the verb, and it means whatever is important to you. Or values are reduced to subjective, private opinions. And so I realized, hey, this is the same thing Schaeffer was talking about. Now, in my later books, I kept developing it because if your concept of truth is so fundamental, it shapes everything else. So in my book, Saving Leonardo, for total truth, I dealt with the fact-value split and showed how for Christians, it is the main barrier to communicating Christian truth today. Because when you talk about Christian truth, people automatically, unreflectively, think you're talking about the value realm. They don't even hear you making an objective truth claim. So when Christians talk about Christian truths, people don't hear them talking about actual truths. They think they're talking about my personal preferences, what gives me meaning in life, what gives me a sense of what makes me feel good, what makes me get through the night. So people no longer even hear Christians making objective truth claims.
So taking this step by step, theology, morality, values are considered to be private, subjective, relativistic. That's the upper story. And then science, facts, and so forth, that's considered to be public and objective and valid for everyone. So the lower story is where we tend to live and the types of teaching that people regularly get through media and academia. And the upper story is just considered private, personal, relativistic, and thus nothing that should be communicated publicly, right? So that's the first step along this way. And then you talk about a sacred secular split. And maybe you could go into that a little bit, in upper and lower.
Yeah, good. It's a good point, because many Christians have essentially a Christianized version of the fact-value split, and they don't realize it. We call it the sacred secular split. And in Christian circles, it is common for people to think religious things are more important. Spiritual things are more important. The upper story is the realm of spiritual, that's your church, your Bible study, your prayer life, and so on. That's what's really important to you. And they tend to not always know how to deal with the secular realm. In other words, what does it mean to bring your Christianity out into your job, into your profession, into your understanding of politics, into your understanding of education, entertainment, the entire sort of rest of the world. I run into a lot of people, like my students, for example, who they want to have an understanding of how their faith relates to everything else, but they don't know how to do it. One of my students put it this way. She's a grad student said, I was always taught spirit good, body bad. The spiritual realm is what's really important, and the physical realm is really not so important for a Christian. So a lot of my writings are also addressing the sacred secular split and how to bring Christianity into all of life. I really think that that's the clue to experiencing the joy and the fulfillment of your Christian life, is to unlock it from the upper story and bring it out into the lower story so that it has an impact on everything you do.
Okay, so let's continue this step-by-step process here. You write in Loving Thy Body about Descartes and dualism, the difference between the understanding of mind and body, and so forth. Upper story, lower story. Could you explain a little bit about the relevance of that?
Yeah, why don't I jump into an example, because sometimes it's easier to see that way. Let's take abortion. Professional bioethicists today all agree that life begins at conception. The evidence from DNA and genetics is too strong to deny it. But they'll say that's the lower story. That's the realm of facts. That's the realm of biology. Human beings are biologically, physiologically, genetically human. But they'll say that doesn't mean they have a right to legal protection, because merely being human is not enough to qualify for human rights. Because if you think of it in the upper and lower story, that's in the lower story where we talk about the body. The fetus does not become a person until it achieves a certain level of cognitive functioning or autonomy, self-determination, and so on. And then it jumps into the upper story, and only then does it acquire the right to legal protection. So when thinkers like Descartes, if you look back at Western intellectual history, key people had that mind-body dualism that we're now seeing played out in issues like abortion, where just being human is not enough to qualify for human rights. And then you ask, why is that? Why do they have such a negative view of being human? Why don't they see more value in being human? And the answer is that since Descartes, we've had other people like Darwin come along and press home even further the notion that being biologically human is not enough to qualify for any special rights or dignity. Essentially, nature, your view of ethics comes from your view of nature. And if nature is a product of blind material forces, then the human body is just a collection of cells, organs, and tissues, no different from any other chance configuration of matter. And that's why just being human is no longer thought to have any special status or dignity. So that, for example, what supporters of abortion are saying then is, as long as the fetus is merely human, it can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be harvested for organs. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, like Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. So what we're seeing is that in the lower story, where we're talking about the human being as a biological organism, it has been incredibly devalued, dehumanized, and degraded. And it's one of the things that Christians need to come across with their message is, wait a minute, we're actually promoting a much higher view of what it means to be human.
Okay. How does postmodernism figure into this, as we're talking about different intellectual currents? The upper story, autonomous self, lower story, physical self?
Yeah, so this has a greater impact when we get into questions like homosexuality, because again, we're seeing a mind-body dualism, where the postmodernism is actually saying that your gender is a social construction, and that your body has no implications for who you are as a person. Think of it this way. Nobody really denies that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. So when a person embraces a same-sex identity, they are contradicting that design. They're essentially saying, why should my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex, as male or female, have any voice in my moral decisions? This is a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. And so this gives us an opportunity as Christians to say, well, wait a minute. We're not just coming at you with a negative message. It's a sin. It's wrong. Don't do it. All the thou shalt nots. Instead, what we're saying is we want to help you have a higher view of the dignity and value of the body. It gives us an opportunity to craft a positive message.
So the irony here is that for a long time, Christians were being attacked for apparently being up here and not really paying attention to what was in the lower story. And in recent decades, that's been reversed.
I wouldn't say in recent decades. I would say since Love Thy Body came out.
Okay.
In other words, no one is really making that argument. One of the things that has been very interesting to me is that if you read the customer reviews on Amazon or the reviews that have been posted on Facebook, many people have said, I picked up Love Thy Body hoping to master a few handy arguments to current issues. But what I found is that it's transforming me, because they had absorbed the sacred secular split more than they realized. They had a lower view of the body than the biblical view. And they have found that the Love Thy Body is actually transforming their own worldview. The most recent customer review on Amazon said, just as Schaeffer transformed my whole perspective, this book is transforming my whole understanding of what the Christian life is, my whole perspective. So it is, but that is my point, though, is what you're talking about, namely that Christians should be arguing today that we have a higher view of the body. As you pointed out, postmodernism basically says, why should I take my identity from my body? What matters is my mind, my feelings, my desires, my choices, and I can choose to override my body. If I feel, it's widely accepted today that if I feel an opposition between mind and body, it's the mind that wins. And what we should be asking is, why accept such a demeaning view of the body? Why not strive for a higher view of the body? It's even more obvious if we go to transgenderism, because there the transgender narrative is specifically that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex. As a BBC documentary put it, at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And that when that happens, we need to help people who are trapped in the prison of the wrong body. So it's even clearer there that there's an incredible denigration of our body. I have been reading a book by a Princeton University professor who's giving a philosophical defense of transgenderism. And yet, ironically, in the process, she admits that transgenderism involves disconnect, disjunction, self-alienation, and self-estrangement. And this is someone defending it. To which I would say, why would you accept a worldview that is self-estranging and self-alienating? Kids down to kindergarten today are being taught that their body has nothing to do with who they are. They're being taught this self-alienating, self-estranging view. I have recently read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11 to 14, and then detransitioned and reclaimed her identity as a girl. And what she said was, the turning point came when I realized it's okay to learn to love your body. And I thought, what a wonderful quote for a book titled Love Thy Body. My book was already in print, so I don't have the quote in the book. But that is the goal of my book, is to help people to recognize the way to address these contentious issues is with a positive message of having a higher regard for the body.
So the Supreme Court, in its rulings concerning homosexuality and same-sex marriage, was often saying that if we don't give that privilege of marriage to same-sex couples, then we are not respecting their dignity, because they are biologically determined in some way, right? But when it comes to transgenderism, it's the opposite thing, that in fact the body is not determinative at all. It's the mind that decides whether a person should be male or female, right? Is there a contradiction there?
Well, actually, no, because first of all, the American Psychological Association put out a booklet saying scientifically there is no evidence for any particular cause of homosexuality. In context, they were talking about either genetic causes or social causes. And so I think that if the Supreme Court ruled that in the Obergefell decision, by the way, the Supreme Court actually dismissed biology because the attorney arguing defending the law that was under attack actually argued laws that govern marriage are motivated by biology, namely to protect any children that result when a man and a woman have sex. And Justice Kennedy dismissed biology and said, absolutely not. It has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with protecting the personhood of same-sex couples. So it was not really based on biology. It was based on the notion that their personhood must be defended, and which was ironic because that's the same theory used in abortion and euthanasia. There it's actually called personhood theory, the idea that, if you're biologically human, that gives you no rights. What gives you rights is when you have a certain level of cognitive functioning that allows us to call you a person. In that area, it's actually called personhood theory. And so it was amazing to me when I picked up the Obergefell decision and read the court was now defending homosexuality also with a kind of personhood theory, saying that what matters is what's in your mind, your desires, your wishes, your hopes, rather than biology.
So the gay rights movement for a while was talking about biological determinism, but it sounds like then that the postmodern impulse and these other things of being the upper story overruled that in the mind of Justice Kennedy, and that became the key determinative factor. Is that?
That's true. And the cutting edge right now is sexual fluidity.
Sure.
Researchers like Lisa Diamond who are showing that the vast majority of people who have a same-sex identity actually have a fluid identity. 80% of those who claim have come out as homosexual, who've claimed a homosexual identity, 80% have changed their label at least once from homosexual to heterosexual, bisexual, queer, or unlabeled. I think those were the choices given. So sexual fluidity actually seems to be the cutting edge right now, and I think it's because and it also makes sense logically, because what you're saying like I said earlier, when you choose a same-sex identity, there's a logic in your decision itself. The logic of same-sex identity is saying, why should I follow the direction of my biology? Why should I have a sexual identity that's in line with my biological sex? You no doubt know the outspoken lesbian Camille Paglia. Mm-hmm. Listen to how she defends homosexuality. She does exactly what I'm talking about, where she says, on the one hand, she says, obviously nature has made us male and female. Nature has made us humans a sexually reproducing species. And then she writes, but why not defy nature? Mm-hmm. After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. And we have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So what she's saying is, if the body is a product of purposeless, mindless material forces, then it has no intrinsic purpose. It gives us no moral message. It's not an intrinsic part of our identity. It does not have a purpose that we're obligated to respect. We may do with them as we see fit. So intrinsically, the argument for homosexuality has always been that the body doesn't matter. All that matters really is the mind.
Okay, so existentialist physiology, in a sense, or psychology is now the queen of sciences, basically. Psychology is much more important than physicality, and thus there's no respect for the body. So,
yeah, and I have a chapter on the hookup culture, too, to bring in the rest of us who are heterosexuals. The hookup culture, too, expresses that same body-person divide, that same dichotomy. Because what does the hookup culture say? The script is, and young people know it all too well, the script is that you can have sex that's completely cut off from the whole person, that's completely physical, without any hint of love or commitment. In my book, Love Thy Body, I quote several college students, very poignant quotes, like one whose name is Alicia, and says, hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn everything off except your body, and you make yourself emotionally invulnerable. Another one said, it's body first, personality comes second. Another one said, sex should come out of emotional intimacy, but on the campus today, it's the opposite. And there's one article in Rolling Stone magazine that quoted a young woman who said the mistake people make is they think that there are two distinct elements in a relationship, one emotional and one physical, and they pretend like there are clean lines between them. She's using the language of dualism. You can almost picture, with the upper-lower story with the line between it. And so some critics will say, well, the hookup culture gives sex too much importance. But in reality, it gives sex too little importance. It robs it of the depth and significance that we all long for. To quote another Rolling Stone magazine, they quoted a young man from Austin, Texas, who said, sex is just one piece of body touching another piece of body. It is existentially meaningless. So the hookup culture is treating the human body as though it's just a physical organism driven by physical impulses and instincts. No wonder it's leaving a trail of wounded people. They're trying to live out a worldview that does not fit who they really are.
So, the official slogan of Austin, Texas, the official slogan is "Keep Austin Weird." But that sounds weird what you've said, but it's more than Austin at this point. That's our general culture. How do you fight that when it's so dominant?
Oh, I think that one of the most important things is to realize how deeply rooted it is in science. Modern culture is rooted in science. And once you accept the notion that nature is a product of blind material forces, you will end up with a low view of the body, and that will be expressed in your ethics. It is just logically unavoidable. And so we have to counter it with a different notion of nature. I mean, when Charles Darwin proposed his theory, the view he was seeking to displace is something we can call a teleological view of nature, which is from the Greek word telos, which simply means goal or purpose. It's evident to observation that living things are structured for a purpose, that eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, fins are made for swimming, and wings are made for flying. The only reason the molecules are organized in the particular pattern they are is to fulfill a function. In fact, the whole development of an organism is governed by an inbuilt plan or blueprint. So biologists today cannot avoid the language of teleology, though they often substitute phrases like good engineering design. The sort of smoking gun, I think, is DNA. We now know from genetics that every cell in your body is governed by genetic code, which is the language and information. So the evidence for a teleological view of nature is very strong today. And in a teleological view, of course, it gives rise to the notion that nature has a plan, a purpose, a design. It's not undifferentiated raw material that we can use as we see fit, to quote Camille Paglia. In fact, it's the opposite. We will be happier and healthier when we live in accord with our design, when we live in harmony, when we have an inner alignment between our biological sex, our gender identity, and our sexual desire. The goal is internal unity, a coherence. There's a very well-known postmodern thinker named Judith Butler. She's hailed as the founder of queer theory. And what's interesting is in her book, her most famous book is Gender Trouble. And in her book, she says, people do naturally aspire to an internal harmony, an internal coherence between their biology, their sexual identity, their gender identity, and their sexual desire. She said, but that's people like me. She herself is a lesbian. She describes herself in one interview as a butch lesbian. So she's a masculine lesbian. So she doesn't line up. So she simply announces to her readers that therefore, because people like her exist, we need to give up the natural aspiration towards inner unity. In fact, she calls it denaturalizing. We must denaturalize sex and gender, she says, which means to deny that there's any natural tendency towards unity. To which I say, why should we accept a philosophy that is based on the idea that we're a disconnected, disparate patchwork of bits and pieces that can all be contradictory? I think we tend to be healthier and happier when we accept a worldview that says we are intended to live in harmony and with our, all the parts of our being lined up and in harmony with one another.
I suspect people here have lots of questions as Nancy's been talking. I have some more questions too, but I'd be very glad to entertain your questions at this point, and then I'll come back in with some more. If you want to raise your hand, a microphone will head your way very quickly.
Thank you for coming out this evening. Really appreciate your time. Recently, over the past couple of years, there's been a huge discussion in the nation about body image. And what does a Christian approach to body image look like that seeks to empower people while not resorting to easy platitudes? What does a true and compassionate Christian approach to body image look like?
Well, let me start by saying that when I talk about modern philosophy having a low view of the body, many people will come back and say, well, wait a minute. Seems to me that we make an idol of the body today because with all our special diets and beauty treatments and Botox and plastic surgery, it seems as if we're very focused on the body. To which I respond, well, being obsessed with your body does not mean you accept your body. In fact, usually it's the opposite. It's precisely people who are so obsessed with constantly changing and fixing their body who have a poor body image and who have a low view of the body. Are treating their body almost as if it was in an adversarial way. It's fascinating because there are some feminist authors who write about this as well and who have written very persuasively that just because we have this obsession with the body doesn't mean we respect ourselves, that we love thy body, to use my title. So I agree with you that one of the things that we need to analyze is how the negative view of the body in secular thought has affected us, even on a very practical level, even if we don't accept abortion and homosexuality and these other ways in which the negative view of the body is expressed. Just on a personal level, have we maybe been influenced by secular thinking to have a kind of, to use a philosophical term, it's the instrumentalizing of the body. It's treating the body as somehow not fully part of our true self, but as an object that we control and that we use for our purposes. And therefore, we don't have the same respect and love for our body that I think biblically we're called to have. The biblical view of the human being is much more integrated. The body is part of you, who you are as a person, and it's an expression of your unique personality. And that biblically you are called to love and respect who God made you to be. And let me give you bring it back to the homosexual example, because I have a lot of personal stories in Love Thy Body. It's warmed up with a lot of stories from my students, and it's not just a moral argument. It's got lots of personal anecdotes. And one of my favorite is the anecdote that starts the chapter on homosexuality. And it's a young man named Sean Doherty, and he was exclusively attracted to other men. And when he became a Christian, he decided his only option was celibacy. But today he's married and has 3 kids. So what changed? He said, I stopped regarding my sexual desires as who I was, as my identity. And I started regarding my body as who I was. Instead of trying to change my feelings, which rarely works, he said, I accepted what I had, namely a male body, as a good gift from God. He said, I had to come to the notion that my body was a good thing, that nature comes from the hand of God. My biology comes from the hand of God, and therefore it is fundamentally good. And I think that is a wonderful insight that can apply to all of us, not just people struggling with same-sex feelings, but to understand that the body, from the Christian perspective, our bodies are fundamentally good, and that there should be, and we should accept them.
You quote Sean as saying, I came to think my feelings were relatively superficial in comparison to my physical identity. I mean, that's a revolutionary thought in our culture, where feelings are so dominant right now. Interesting. Why don't you while you're in the storytelling mode, tell us about Jean Lloyd and her tuxedo.
Right. It's a very similar story. But what I found so interesting with these stories is I found them after I had already worked out sort of the philosophical approach I was going to take, that I was going to argue the secular view has a low view of the body. And then I found these examples of people who, in fact, discovered that they came out of the same-sex background precisely by discovering the value of their body. And Jean Lloyd was another example. As a 15-year-old, she wore a tuxedo to her high school prom as a symbol of her gender bending, and lived her lesbian, for about 10 years, a decade, I think. And then she said, I began to accept that my body was a good gift from God, that God had given me this body as female, and that I could trust that God had made me female as a good gift from God. And she said, don't press me into a kind of Gnosticism that separates me from my body. As a Christian, what made the difference and my favorite line actually is when she said, as I began to accept my body, to my own great surprise, a flicker of heterosexual desire emerged. And she is now married with 2 kids. So I do appreciate these examples of people who found that the turning point for them was to recover a higher view of the body.
You give a fascinating statistic. 40% of gay men and 42% of lesbians reported sexual attraction to the opposite sex in the previous year. So that also, Go ahead.
We tend to think that people are 100% homosexual or 100% heterosexual. And the statistic that you just cited is, again, from Lisa Diamond. Lisa Diamond is the first person to start discovering that, wait a minute, many people are not 100%, that it's actually the predominant form is actually some kind of people who have temptations on both sides. And that 100% homosexuals, exclusive homosexuals, are actually the minority, not the majority. that many of them do report same-sex attraction, opposite-sex attraction, opposite-sex relationships, and even opposite-sex sexual relationships. And yet and these are from people who identify as gay or homosexual. So this has been an astonishing find, and it really changes our understanding of what homosexuality is.
Questions?
You've already touched on this a little bit, but if transgenderism and sort of gender dysphoria is a manifestation of the fall, due to sin, human beings are no longer in harmony with God, creation, or our own bodies sometimes, how can Christians present the gospel in a way that offers people hope?
Well, another one of my favorite stories is the story at the beginning of the transgender chapter. It's a story about a boy that I call Brandon, and he was clearly severely gender dysphoric from the time he was quite young. I mean, before he was even walking, his babysitter told his mother, "He's too good to be a boy," by which she meant, he's quiet, he's gentle, he's compliant, he's things that we don't normally associate with boys. In preschool, while the boys roughhoused on one side of this big room, and the little girls sat on the other side and sat in a little circle and talked, he was invariably with the little girls, invariably. By elementary school, he was already telling his parents, "I think like a girl, I feel the way girls do. God should have made me a girl." And it was very painful. He suffered incredible isolation and sense of alienation because he didn't fit anywhere. By 14, he was scouring the internet for information on sex change operations. Fortunately, he decided it would not give him what he wanted. It would not make him a girl. But what did his parents do? His parents, well, first of all, they loved him, and they let him know that they thought he was a beautiful person, even if he was gender nonconforming. They helped him to realize that to be gender nonconforming doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Here's how they kept telling him. They said, "There's nothing wrong. It's not you that's wrong. It's the stereotypes that are wrong. And you are a gentle, sensitive, emotional boy, and God has equipped you perhaps for one of the caring professions, like psychologist." But they also took him through Myers-Briggs personality test to show him that the full range of personality types are open to both men and women. You can be the gentle, sensitive boy, and you can be a take charge, assertive woman. And in either case, that's okay. They even took him through my book, Total Truth, because I have a chapter there on the historical changes in the definition of masculinity and femininity, showing that those definitions are historically contingent, and that he did not have to feel constrained to fit into whatever stereotypes happen to be prevalent in our own historical period, because they change. So there are a whole host of tools and strategies that they use to help him come to peace with the idea that he was a boy, even though even today he's a young man, he's graduated from college, he still has mostly friends who are girls. But that it's okay for him to be that way, and that respect for his body. He read the manuscript of my book when I was preparing it. I wanted his feedback, and to respect the fact that God made you a boy, and that is something that you accept as a good gift from God's hand. In other words, it's a positive message. And once again, right, it's a positive message of love and respect for yourself, rather than just focusing on a negative message.
What happens now when kids in kindergarten are being taught, in essence, gender fluidity? Is this a form of child abuse?
It certainly is teaching young children that their body is not part of who they are. The same, I mentioned a while ago that I was reading a book by a philosopher that was the defense of transgenderism. And here's how she puts it. She says, the physical body has no meaning at all. It tells us nothing about who we are. And that's what's being taught to children down to kindergarten now, is that your body tells you nothing, that your body has no indication of what your identity should be, that all that matters is your mind and emotions. It even is on the level of court cases. There was a Fourth Circuit case where a girl who identified as a boy wanted the right to use a boys' restroom. And her nickname was Gigi. And the court ruled in her favor, saying that Gigi's so-called biological sex, in quotation marks, is female, but Gigi's gender identity is male. Her so-called biological sex, in quotation marks, this was a federal judge writing a formal ruling, and he treats biological sex with suspicion. In other words, he apparently thinks that your DNA, your genetics, your physiology, your anatomy is less real than a teenager's subjective feelings. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and under the Obama ruling, you remember he wrote the Obama administration had sent out a guidance letter to all the public schools telling them that they had to enforce transgender policies. That was still in effect when that case went to the Supreme Court. And of course, as a result, transgender activists were quite sure that they were going to win. Then Donald Trump was elected, and he reversed it. And so the case was remanded back to the Fourth Circuit. But that's how close we came to having a federal policy that expressed the notion that your biological sex is not part of who you are, that all that matters is your desires, your feelings. And that is why schools are enforcing policies telling teachers who they must call he or she, regardless of the student's biological sex.
So that sounds like a wacko judge, but essentially what I understand from Love Thy Body is in many ways that is an extension of this upper story, lower story divide that's just been growing. So if you're criticizing that, do you criticize the thing itself, or do you have to go back and look at, well, here's the logical progression and why that logical progression actually is illogical?
Well, I'm always one for I think that we understand things better when we go back and see where they came from. In Love Thy Body, I used that phrase several times. I would say, now, if we want to understand this, we need to see where it came from. So I'm very much in favor of understanding the key thinkers. It's been part of the Western thought almost from the beginning. Plato had the upper-lower story divide. Plato talked about the prison house of the soul, the body being the prison house of the soul. And you mentioned Descartes. Another key person was Kant, because Kant's the one who says your mind essentially creates reality. So that a lot of the postmodern notion, the postmodern message that you can create your own identity and even your body is a social construction. Which reminds me of how can we talk to Christians about this? If it goes all the way back to people like Plato, Christians need to recover their own heritage. The early church was born into a world that also denigrated the material realm. It was born into a culture dominated by philosophies like Platonism and Gnosticism that taught that the universe is the place of death, decay, and destruction. And Gnosticism even taught that there are several levels of spiritual beings, and that it was a low-level deity, an evil god, who created this world. And the goal of salvation was to escape from the material world, to escape from the prison house of the soul. In this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary, because it said that it was the supreme God, not a low-level deity, but it's the supreme God who created this universe, and therefore it was intrinsically good. But the biggest scandal at the time was the concept of the Incarnation, because what it said was that that same supreme deity had actually entered into the material world and taken on a physical body. So the Incarnation was the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. And when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, we might say he did escape the material world as Gnosticism taught that we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical, bodily resurrection. To the Greeks at the time, that was not spiritual progress. That was regress. Who would want to come back to the body? It was, to the Greeks, it was a foolishness to the Greeks, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
And then at the end of time, God is not going to scrap the material universe as if he made a mistake the first time. He's going to renew it and restore it and create a new heavens and a new earth. So the Apostles' Creed affirms the resurrection of the body. This is an astonishingly high view of the physical realm. There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. And that's what we need to recover. We have a phenomenally high view of the physical realm that should be at the heart of our approach when we reach out to non-Christians.
Yeah. Questions, and particularly students here. Does this help, let's say, when you're dealing with people who have very different worldviews? Please go ahead.
This question is on something that's not been talked about a whole lot, but I think it relates to a lot of what we've been talking about this evening. The recent development of artificial intelligence has been raising a lot of questions about what it means to be human. Do you think the development of artificial intelligence poses a challenge to Christianity's idea that body and soul necessarily go together? And if so, how should Christians respond to people raising these questions?
Yeah, I have a section in the book on transhumanism, and I think it's the ultimate expression of the body-person dualism, because what it's saying is many transhumanists are saying, humanity is just one step in the evolutionary progress, an insignificant step, and we really should be using genetic engineering and so on to advance to the next step. So again, it's a very low view of what it means to be human, for starters. And then secondly, there are people who are saying, well, we should, there are some people even promoting the notion that we can have a kind of digital immortality if we could download our brains, download our minds onto a computer disk, and we could get rid of our bodies altogether. There's a very, very, very wealthy transgender woman, in other words, born male, Martine Rothblatt, and she argues for the idea of a sort of download of your mind onto a computer disk. And she says, if you object to that, if you say, well, wait a minute, isn't there some value in being a flesh and blood human being? She says, in that case, you're guilty of fleshism. In other words, it's a sin of preferring your flesh, kind of like racism is the sin of preferring your own race, or sexism is the sin of preferring your own sex. To prefer a flesh and blood body it means you are guilty of fleshism.
Isn't she guilty of brainism?
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Good point. That's a good comeback. So I would say that it does give us one more opportunity to make the case that it is Christianity that has a high view of the body and the body-person integration. We are talking about psychosexual integration that is being lost by our culture. And the irony is, of course, that historically Christians we've been accused of having a low view of this world, of bodily existence, of caring only about the next world. And today our message to secular people is we care much more about this world and about the body than you do.
Other questions? Well, yeah, again, to the students, let me ask, I mean, how can you use this when you're in discussions? How can this be helpful? How can you apply it? Well, let me ask you, Nancy, how should they apply it?
Well, I was thinking of one example. When I was writing Love Thy Body, I did run into a lot of people who said, God made some people homosexual. And, God made me this way. So what I say to them is actually, I quote a former homosexual. His name is Tim Wilkins, and he's now married and has 3 children. And he puts it this way. He said, if God made someone gay, then God has played a cruel joke on them because he's engineered their mind and emotions for attraction to the same sex, but he's created their physiology to be in opposition to that attraction. And so, in a sense, you are saying that God made me with this internal conflict, this internal opposition. And I would suggest that it's counter to the whole Christian worldview. The whole Christian worldview is no, God made you with your body to be in harmony with who you are. So that would be, I think, one of the most common applications that you'll run into is how do you deal with people who say, God made me gay. Another application might be this. You cannot talk about these issues very long before somebody will say, well, what about intersex? Doesn't the existence of intersex people prove that, disprove the male-female binary, that there's male and female, but there's also a spectrum in between? Well, intersex people are simply people whose anatomy is ambiguous or atypical because of genetic or hormonal reasons. And we can identify those reasons. We know exactly what causes intersex. And the thing, though, the counter to the notion of a spectrum in between is that there's still only 2 gametes. There's sperm and there's egg. There is no third gamete. So intersex people themselves, if you read their own writings, most of them are not clamoring to destroy or deconstruct the male-female binary. Most of them are happy to be male or female. An intersex woman that I interviewed in my book said, I don't like being a political football by either side. I don't like being shoved into the LGBT camp by either side. And so this is another topic that comes up a lot when you're talking about these issues. There's a well-known, one of the most popular TED Talks is by a cardiologist named Paula Johnson, and it's titled, Every Cell Has a Sex. Every cell has a sex. And as a cardiologist, of course, her main concern is that men's and women's hearts are different. That the symptoms of an impending heart attack that men have are not the same symptoms that women have. And yet most of the testing has been done on men. And as a result, doctors are not familiar with the symptoms that women have. So women will come in, present their symptoms, and the doctors will say, well, what you have is not what I'm familiar with, and so they'll send them home, and then they have a heart attack. So her main concern is on a physiological level, women's symptoms are very different, all the way down to the molecular and cellular level. And when I went online to watch the video, underneath her video were dozens and dozens of quotes saying she's transphobic. And one person offered an interesting response. He said, look, all she's saying is, whatever your gender theory, when you get sick and the doctors put you on the operating table, they need to know your original biological sex to make sure you get the best medical care. Because every cell has a sex.
Last question, anyone?
Thank you again for coming out to talk to us today. So you've mentioned a lot of people who your message has helped, and they've stopped experiencing, or at least to a degree, stopped experiencing homosexual attraction. But how can this message be of help to Christians who, say, don't want to be experiencing the homosexual attraction but continue to do so?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that many of them haven't really thought about it from the angle that I've presented in the book. And I'd like to see what happens when they do, because the few people that I found whose experience had changed, like the two I mentioned, two stories I gave earlier, were both people who had come to it by a great appreciation of their body. And so many people just haven't really thought about it this way, and I'd like to see what happens when they read the book. But secondly, I did quote a lot of people in the book also who were in the position that you described. In other words, they were Christians, they had become Christians, and their sexual orientation had not changed. And for them, I like to quote Christopher Yuan. Do you know Christopher Yuan? He was a person who would engage in multiple anonymous same-sex encounters in a single day, and was doing drugs as well, and was finally arrested for drug dealing. He went to prison and found a Bible in the trash, pulled it out, and became a Christian. And he writes this wonderful line. He says, "The goal is not heterosexuality, the goal is holiness. And no matter what temptations you experience, the goal is holiness." And you remember the numbers that Dr. Olasky mentioned a few moments ago about the large number of people who are homosexual but still have heterosexual temptations, should we say, who still have heterosexual attractions. Well, the same Lisa Diamond, the same researcher, found that many heterosexuals, more than we may have realized, also have homosexual attractions, especially these days when we're so surrounded by it. So for either group, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, the challenge is the same. The challenge is holiness. The challenge is to live with what Paul called the thorn in the flesh. The thorn probably is taken from Genesis, where the impact of the fall was given the metaphor of thorns and thistles. So the thorn probably meant something to do with the effect of the fall. And we all experience the effect of the fall in some way, in our sexuality, in our family, in our health, in our relationships, wherever. And so we all have the same calling before God to live out a world of holiness, even when it's difficult, even when it's a struggle, even when it's a challenge.
Yeah, a good note. Christopher, by the way, was here a couple of years ago, interviewed him, and if you want to watch that, I believe it's on YouTube and also the Patrick Henry website. If you want to pursue this further, these types of questions further, another good interview to look up. We've actually done it twice here with Rosaria Butterfield, and the first of those interviews I think has been viewed more than 120,000 times, so it's had an impact, and I'd recommend looking at that to any of you. And of course, those interviews and the other 115 or so that I've done here were all done in person. And this one had to be done electronically because I gave Nancy the wrong date. And I appreciate very much, Nancy, your doing your schedule to be able to do this from Houston Baptist University. So please join me in giving Nancy a hand.